The struggle for survival between humans and microbes goes back to the inception of life on Earth. When microbes won the battle on several occasions, people died in large numbers in less time. When humans won, the spread of viruses, parasites and bacteria was weakened. This was done with the help of vaccines, behavioral changes and drugs. An existential crisis similar to COVID-19 surfaced in 1855. In the next few decades, a microbe killed millions around the world. India was not spared either. People were scared at the very sight of rats. Very much like in the COVID-19 crisis, migrants left infected urban settlements in large numbers. Epidemic Diseases Act that the Government of India amended during the COVID-19 crisis goes back to that period. The British colonial government brought it to control a pandemic that was threatening to spiral out of control.
1855 to 1959, the third plague pandemic. Deaths over 15 million cause Yersinia pestis bacterium. The third plague pandemic emerged from its wild rodent reservoir in the remote Chinese province of Yunnan in 1855. From there, the disease advanced along the tin and opium routes and reached the provincial capital of Kunming in 1866, the Gulf of Tonking in 1867, and the Kwangtung province port of Pakhoi, now known as Peihai, in 1882. In 1894, it had reached Canton and then spread to Hong Kong. It spread to Bombay by 1896. And by 1900 had reached ports on every continent. It was carried by infected rats travelling the international trade routes on the new steamships. It was in Hong Kong in 1894 that Swiss and French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin discovered the bacterium now known as Yersinia pestis. In 1898 in Karachi, French biologist Paul-Louis Simond discovered that the brown rat was the primary host and the rat flea was the vector of the disease. An infected person incubated the disease for 6 to 7 days before showing symptoms, which were swelling of the lymph nodes in the area of the groin and armpits. The person usually died within 48 hours of the first signs of swelling. The mortality rate was as high as 60%. The plague entered India through the port city of Mumbai via Hong Kong. During the early stages of the plague, the British did nothing to stop the disease from spreading, as they did not want to impede the thriving global trade in any way. As a result, they kept all ports fully functional for commercial activities. This proved disastrous as the bubonic plague soon started spreading rapidly in India.
The first case in India was reported from Mandvi, a congested locality near the docks in Bombay in May 1896. The numbers multiplied soon, and when the situation spun out of control, the British hastily drafted the Epidemic Diseases Act and began to enforce it in India. The Act gave local authorities the power to do virtually anything they needed to salvage the situation without any legal ramifications. Never before had the state in India intervened so directly and forcefully in the lives of Indians. This produced a massive backlash from the Indian public and freedom fighters.
You have an episode of plague that begins really in a very small way in Bombay, spreads across the city. It especially affects all the migrant workers who are in the cotton mills in Bombay. They get into a panic. There are a lot of plague deaths, especially in the areas of Mandvi and Parel. They get on trains and they leave. There are many who go by foot into the villages. And as a result of it, the plague spreads very, very quickly from Bombay to, even within the first year, to Haridwar, which is a pilgrimage spot. And from there, again, of course, pilgrims take it to the rest of India. It spreads to Hyderabad state. And by 1902, 1903, what you have is the plague has spread to everywhere, basically, across British India. It's there in port cities like Karachi. It affects large cities like Lahore and Madras. And as a result of it, what you have is you have, for instance, this commissioner, W.G. King, who's the sanitary commissioner of the city of Madras, who in panic says, in spite of the fact that we've experienced the plague in places like Bombay and it has spread to many other places, people are still not observing quarantine. He cannot make it compulsory anymore because the kind of violence that had been produced, the resistance that people had exhibited to coercion due to plague rules in Pune and Bombay, meant that when the plague went to other places, the plague rules also shifted. So the plague laws were very coercive, very intrusive and interventionist. There were women and men who were checked at railway stations and people protested.
The then Assistant Commissioner of Pune, W.C. Rand, was tasked with implementing the act. Initially, Rand made a genuine effort to provide relief by setting up quarantine camps and hospitals, while also disinfecting the plague-affected areas. However, as the situation worsened, Rand adopted brutal measures which stripped Indians of their dignity. Often, buildings, food, clothes, and other properties of the affected individuals were ruthlessly burnt and destroyed without their permission. Bal Gangadhar Tilak was one such leader who gave a voice to the citizens of India and wrote against the government's high-handedness in his paper Kesari. His writings inspired the Chapekar brothers from Pune, Damodar, Balkrishna and Vasudev, and on the midnight of the 22nd of June 1897, the trio shot dead Rand and his military escort. As the bubonic plague continued to take large numbers of lives across India, the British government pressurized the noted Russian bacteriologist Valdemar Haffkine to develop a vaccine against the disease as early as possible. 3 months later, Haffkine was ready for a human trial. On 10th January 1897, he tested the vaccine first on himself, and after that, volunteers from the Baikala jail were inoculated. The inoculated inmates survived the epidemic, and the vaccine was thereafter made available to Indians. By the turn of the century, 4 million people were inoculated in India. The epidemic lasted for well over 2 decades in India, killing about 10 million Indians between 1896 and 1918 as it ravaged one city after the other.
When the plague comes year after 1896 until the 1920s, there are other cities, for instance, that are affected later, like Madras, that begin to say, what kinds of rules do we have really? That how do we have these kinds of quarantines that are necessary still to stem the plague? So there is no cure for the plague at that time. At the same time, what people are trying to do is to have what we have even today in India with COVID-19 is that they are deploying intervention circles, they're having defensive circles, they're having places to quarantine people who are reporting the plague. And they're trying their best at this point of time, but what's happening is that the public health and other infrastructure of health services was so poor in British India that there is very little that's being done to be able to help with the plague.
It spread quickly to Bengal, Punjab and United Provinces, and later even to Burma. However, its impact was most severe in western and northern India, while southern and eastern India escaped with relatively fewer deaths. By 1901, 4 lakh Indians were reported dead, and by 1905, the toll was 10 lakh. The third plague pandemic waxed and waned throughout the world for the next 5 decades and did not end until 1959. By then, the plague had caused over 15 million deaths, the majority of which were in India. There have been several outbreaks of the plague since. 1918 to 1920. The Spanish flu, deaths 50 to 100 million, cause H1N1 virus.
The 1918 influenza pandemic was the most severe pandemic in recent history. The COVID-19 pandemic has inspired lots of comparisons to the 1918 flu, sometimes called the Spanish flu, which got its name not because it originated in Spain, but because then the World War I was on and Spain was the only country being honest about the toll the pandemic took on the country. The flu came in 3 waves, starting in 1918 and ending in 1920. The number of infected was staggering, as many as 500 million, with estimates of 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. The death toll of the pandemic surpassed that of World War I. It infected 1 in every 3 people on the planet. The virus's unique severity puzzled researchers for decades and prompted several questions like, why was the 1918 virus so deadly? Where did the virus originate from? And what can the public health community learn from the 1918 virus to better prepare for future pandemics? These questions drove researchers and virus hunters to search for the lost 1918 virus.
When the scientists started working, one of the scientists who was Dr. Hultin, who went to Alaska, where he had come to know that of the 80 people who were staying in one of the places called as Brevet, where these 80 people were living, 72 had succumbed in 1918 to this illness. Only 8 people were survivors and they were buried there. So he thought, if I have to find out what was the cause, I will take out their bodies again, take those organs back and try to locate this particular organism as to what kind of organism exists. So he made an adventurous trip to Alaska. He went all the way. He took permission from the community. He tried to collect the sample from those dead bodies. When he tried to culture this particular virus or find out which organism is there, he was not successful. But there was another group of scientists which was working similarly. They came to know about a death of a US Army personnel in 1918, and they took out lung tissue from that individual, but no complete genome sequencing could be done. So they found it very difficult to infer, but they published the paper. The same Hultin, who was still alive, now he was 72 years of age, he read that paper and then he said, I haven't taken out those bodies completely, it's Alaska. So it would be buried in so much of ice, so they may still be there. So he went back to the same place. He again took the permission. This time he brought a lung tissue from a lady called as Anne. No, she was named as Anne. And this he brought this time in cold chain. And then the discovery came that this is one type of influenza virus.
In India, as it happens almost as if people don't they are already suffering from the plague pandemic. And what happens is that there is a return of these soldiers. We've had a range of Indian soldiers who've been involved in the First World War, in the World War's theater of the plague, especially in the Mesopotamian front. And when they return, they bring really the influenza with them, and they take it once they disembark, especially, for instance, soldiers from agricultural communities in Punjab. They move to all of these villages, and in the central provinces and parts of Punjab, you have entire villages where people really die of this pandemic. It's believed that these soldiers who came from Basra in Iraq bring it into India. And they were enlisted in the war effort, for instance. So they move and it affects all of these provinces all over North India.
Much like COVID-19, transport was the key culprit in past pandemics. Spanish flu entered India through Bombay, most likely on a troop ship returning from the First World War in Europe, and then spread across the country from the west and south to the east and north. COVID-19 spread across the world through international travel as well. In 1918, studies found that the key to flattening the curve was social distancing. And that remains true a century later in the current battle against novel coronavirus. The lessons of 1918, if well heeded, might help us avoid repeating the same history today. But there are dissimilarities too. While COVID-19 is proving to be more fatal for the elderly and those with comorbidities, the unusual characteristic of Spanish flu was the high mortality rate among the young and healthy, a group that usually has a very low death rate from influenza. 1957 to 1958, Asian flu, deaths 1.1 million, cause H2N2 virus. The Asian flu was a global pandemic that originated in China. It was first detected in Singapore in February 1957, reached Hong Kong in April 1957, and the coastal cities of the United States in the summer of 1957. The disease claimed over 1 million lives globally. The virus originated from mutation in wild ducks, combining with a pre-existing human strain. A vaccine for H2N2 was introduced in 1957 and the pandemic slowed down. There was a second wave in 1958 and H2N2 went on to become part of the regular wave of seasonal flu. In 1968, H2N2 Asian flu disappeared from the human population and is believed to have gone extinct in the wild. (1976) to date, Ebola cause Ebola virus.
Ebola, a deadly disease that killed a large number of those it infected, raised its head in the 1970s in West Africa. From West Africa, Ebola did not move to other parts of the world because high mortality rate prevented the virus from transmitting to other countries. Those infected died quickly. So there was no opportunity for the virus to infect others. That's the reason why Ebola remained an epidemic and did not become a pandemic. There are Ebola outbreaks even today in Africa. Ebola taught lessons that shaped medical principles, and those principles are being used today in the battle against COVID-19.
Ebola virus was found in 1976 near the Ebola River in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo.
I mean, it was understood really as a zoonotic infection that often happened at that point of time amongst forest edge communities, those who stayed in isolated areas, hunters who often came into contact sometimes with dead animals such as chimpanzees, with fruit bats, who are often symptomless carriers of the virus. But what happens later when there are episodes both in Uganda, which is one of the first largest outbreaks, and later on when it occurs also in Liberia and Guinea, what we understand is that human contact with these ecologies and forests is getting more, much more intensive than before. And Ebola brings out the lack of an emergency response, the fact that the WHO's emergency response status really took a lot of time to put into place, especially at the outset. So what we realize is that epidemics like Ebola need intervention very quickly.
Since then, the virus has emerged periodically and infected people in several African countries. Ebola virus disease is rare and deadly. The virus that causes it is located mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. People can get it through direct contact with an infected animal or a sick or dead person infected with Ebola virus.
Interestingly, in COVID-19 outbreak, which has high transmissibility and fear of death continues to be high in vulnerable populations, which are old people belonging to old age, and those who have chronic morbidities, you find that remedies which people think could be useful are allowed to be utilized on compassionate ground without undergoing trials at this point in time because of the emergency that has been posed. So, Ebola paved way to develop principles of undertaking trials in a different way when it's a pandemic situation.
The 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa began in a rural setting of southeastern Guinea, spread to urban areas and across borders within weeks, and became a global epidemic within months. 1980s to date, HIV, deaths 32 million, cause HIV virus. Scientists identified a type of chimpanzee in Central Africa as the source of HIV infection in humans. They believe that the chimpanzee version of the immunodeficiency virus most likely was transmitted to humans and mutated into HIV when humans hunted these chimpanzees for meat and came into contact with their infected blood. Studies show that HIV may have jumped from apes to humans as far back as the late 1800s. Over decades, the virus slowly spread across Africa and later into other parts of the world. However, it wasn't until the early 1980s when rare types of pneumonia, cancer and other illnesses were being reported to doctors that the world became aware of HIV and AIDS. Over time, HIV can destroy the immune system. When the body is unable to fight infections and diseases, it eventually leads to the most severe form of HIV infection, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome or AIDS. A person with AIDS is very vulnerable to cancer and life-threatening infections such as pneumonia. HIV has killed around 32 million people worldwide and infected 75 million, with more added every day, but it still lacks a vaccine.
This is a virus where there is no vaccine, and just because of the medicines that we have, antiretroviral drugs, we will perhaps be able to eliminate HIV, and within such a short period of almost close to about 3 decades that have passed since the recognition of this particular virus, which is a major victory because most of the viral diseases that we have conquered are conquered because of preventive vaccine that exists. This virus is very smart. The virus keeps on changing its envelope, and the result is development of vaccine is not so easy, but it is just the medicines which paved way towards control of this particular infection.
There is no effective cure for HIV, but with proper medical care, HIV can be controlled. Effective antiretroviral drugs can control the virus and help prevent onward transmission to other people.
In 1987, the first drug was discovered, which was zidovudine, and then in 1994, protease inhibitors as a class of drug was discovered. A combination regime of these drugs using 3 different drugs was provided to people from 1995 onwards, and the result was it led to dramatic improvement in survival.
India has the 3rd largest HIV epidemic in the world.
It's also a very interesting story of 2 women, actually, of Suniti Solomon and her student, Dr. Selappa Nirmala. They decided that they were going to test female sex workers in Chennai in Tamil Nadu. This is the point of time when people were saying, especially in India at this time, they were saying that HIV/AIDS is a disease of the debauched West, right? Where you have free sex and homosexuality, and Indians, on the other hand, were God-fearing and monogamous and unlikely to get it. And especially in the city of Chennai, which was a kind of more traditional and surrounded by temples and other things, it was very unlikely that they would find these cases. And that's when they begin to start this case. They take samples from sex workers based in Chennai. And once they find these cases, it becomes a big thing. That's when it's just the tip of the iceberg. they take they take less than 100 samples, and that's when India really comes to terms with the fact that this is the tip of the iceberg, that there is going to be a huge crisis. And we have to have the sorts of institutions and agencies that will be able to address AIDS.
In 2017, 2.1 million Indians were living with HIV. HIV was prevalent among 0.2% of Indian adults. For a strong response to HIV/AIDS, India started the National AIDS Control Program in 1992. It made focused efforts to reach high-risk groups with HIV interventions. The first phase was implemented from 1992 to 1999 and focused on monitoring HIV infection rates among high-risk populations in urban areas. In the second phase from 1999 to 2006, the focus was on promoting behavioral change. The Prevention of Mother-to-Child Transmission Program and the provision of antiretroviral treatment were developed. In 2007, the third phase of the National AIDS Control Program targeted high-risk groups and conducted outreach programs. It also decentralized the effort to local levels and non-governmental organizations to provide welfare services to the affected. The program and other interventions by the Government of India resulted in 21% decline in new HIV infections in India from 2010 to 2017, and deaths due to AIDS fell by 56% in India.
Especially with HIV, what you have to remember is the notion of stigma. In 1983, for instance, when a doctor in New York got HIV/AIDS, he was threatened with eviction. This really led to the first AIDS discrimination lawsuit. Schools barred children who had HIV from attending. It was only when public figures, Hollywood actors like Rock Hudson, who was the first major figure really to acknowledge that he had AIDS, when he acknowledges it in public on TV and he dies in 1985, leaving about $250,000, I think, to a foundation, to an AIDS foundation. And when Elizabeth Taylor, Princess Diana, and others become involved, that's when people begin to be victimizing and looking at those who are suffering from AIDS in more inclusive ways than before.
When it came to India, it was a challenging task. One task is, since this disease was associated with unprotected sex with multiple partners, this disease was also seen among injecting drug users. This was also seen among men having sex with men. Now, these things were considered as socially undesirable kind of things. So, people used to think that why should I work for these people who practice something which is socially not tolerated. But we took a chance by positioning prevention of mother-to-child transmission using these antiretroviral drugs. The drugs against it are generally called as antiretroviral drugs, to provide it to mother so that the child doesn't acquire that. Now, when we did that, it was realized that that kind of stigma that it had, HIV stigma, that it is associated with people who have undesirable activities, was reduced to a larger extent.
Novel coronavirus is one type of coronavirus. SARS, first reported in 2003, and MERS, first identified in 2012, were also coronaviruses. Comparisons between COVID-19, SARS and MERS and reports of different strains of novel coronavirus lead us to ask many questions. Are some strains of novel coronavirus more infectious than the others? Why did the WHO say that the extent of asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19 was around 40%? Where did the word corona come from? How do SARS and MERS compare with COVID-19? Is exposure to other coronaviruses earlier in life helping people fight COVID-19? What is the second wave of COVID-19 infection? Why wasn't there a second wave of SARS? Will SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 become milder over time? Is there any effective vaccine for an RNA virus? How soon will the world have an effective drug against COVID-19? Has COVID-19 crisis spurred the scientific community to innovate? And is COVID-19 pandemic impacting geopolitics in significant ways? BioQuest will return with answers.